Peyton, you've planted several churches, and what I love about you is you go into communities. You're not trying to find the community that's growing the fastest, building new homes. You're going in and saying, where are the marginalized, and how can we pick a fight with injustice or needs there to help change and transform a community. A lot of church planters and churches I talk to, they want to make a difference with homelessness and hunger and sex trade and things like that are in their communities. What would you tell a church that's saying, hey, we want to make a difference with that community? What are you seeing? What should be done? What needs to be done? Sometimes it feels like a program rather than a lifestyle.
Right. Yeah, I think that really through a lot of the training that we did with you, particularly through the missional engagement, I would meet with church planners who they would read that passage about, I'm going to be all things to all men. Yeah. And their definition of all things was about this small. Yes, yeah. The true definition of their city was all things were this big, and they would have blind spots. I think the first question to ask is, who am I not seeing? For example, all of us have prejudice. We don't want to admit it, but we do. Yeah. And so, for example, if I were teaching on racial reconciliation in the church and trying to get people to see their blind spot, I would ask a congregation, because we're aware of our history in America with the African American population. We're becoming perhaps aware of how we've marginalized the Hispanic population. That's current in conversation. The Asian community, we've been aware, particularly through social media, of ways that we've dishonored them. But I'll ask a congregation, give me one example of a popular figure in American pop culture from the Arabic community. And everybody's stumped. And it can't be a cartoon character. It can't be Aladdin. You can't mention a Disney character. Yeah, it has to be a real-life example. Yeah. And everybody's stumped. And I will say the most dangerous form of racism or prejudice is the one you're not aware of. Wow. And I think for most churches, it's not enough to talk about the stuff you see. I think the deeper question for leaders is to say, what am I not seeing? Yeah. And because of that, you've got to start talking to people you never talk to. You've got to start talking to the homosexual community. Yeah. Because to be honest, when Paul says, I became all things to all men. When I came into the Rainbow District, I had to ask a really strange question, because Paul says, I became all things to all men. To the Jew, I became as a Jew. To the Gent, what does it say for me? What does it look like for me to say, to the homosexual, I became as a homosexual? Right. That means I have to get inside their head, hear what the barriers are, what's keeping them from God. What is it from keeping? And we baptize people that came out of that lifestyle and repented and eventually became, followers of Jesus in the biblical sense of that word. But we had to start by asking some uncomfortable questions.
That is in session 2 of in our church plant training. That's one of the questions when I would lead that would stump guys. Because we'd say, okay, we'd read that passage, to the Jew I became the Jew, and then we would say, we would make them list needs. Remember that? Let's list some people in your community.
This is straight out of that training.
Oh my goodness, yeah. And so they would list, homeless people and people who've been sexually abused, and we begin to ask that question. How do you become homeless to the homeless? How do you become sexually abused to those who are sexually abused? And homosexual to the homosexual. That question wrecked them every single time, because they're like, whoa, I haven't thought about that.
Right.
And we've got to get inside their minds. It was fascinating. I was walking down the beach in Carlsbad today, and I saw an older gentleman, and he was kicking cans. And I walked up to him and I said, "Can I help you pick those up?" And he was obviously homeless, and he said, "Well, thank you, sir." And so I reached down. I'm picking up the cans. I'm down on my knees picking up the cans. He says, "Are you a pastor?" And I looked up at him like that. I was like, "What?" I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, you're carrying a Bible." And I said, "Well, it's actually not a Bible. It's my journal." I said, "But I am a pastor." And so we start talking, and I ask him his story. This guy's he's 65 years old. He's been homeless for 20 years. And we get in a conversation about Christ. And he said, I believe in God. I believe in the Bible. I believe in Jesus. And we're talking about all that. And I'm sharing about the love of God and the grace of God. And we get to this point, and it was so funny because he was so honored that I asked his story. He was so excited to share his story. And so as I got to know him and his story, and time was getting by and I had to leave, and I said, hey, I got a friend that pastors a church down the road. I'd love for you to go visit. And he said, no, I'm not going to church. And I said, well, why? He said, well, I believe in God, but churches, they don't want me. And I said, no, this church is different. They will accept you. They would love for you to be there. And he said, no, I'm not going there because evil people hide in church.
Wow.
And his perception of Christian community and his perception of church, and I wonder how many people who we would call marginalized, they're so open to God. He was so open to Christ.
Yeah.
He wouldn't step into church because of the perception he had and his fears.
That was in let's be honest, I mean, that's how it was in Jesus' day, right? Like the temple and the Pharisees, that's where the real evil's hiding out. And Jesus is saying, hey, all these other people, they're flocking to me. And I think that's where we have to come to the point where, we would hear that and maybe people would get defensive. Well, the church. No, this guy's telling you he's open to Jesus. So what we have to learn to do is to what Peterson called is really planting churches without walls. What does church look like on the beach? Like if I'm gonna plant here in a community like this, it can't be like what I did in Long Beach. This is my next challenge. Is I have nothing that got me here is going to get me there. None of my experiences are going to do for me what was done for me in Long Beach. I've got to start over. Each and every single time, I've got to start from ground zero again. It's me and the Holy Spirit. And I find this, that you mentioned about, you're here and you're talking to this guy. You're outside of your culture, on the East Coast. You're here, you're in this. And I find that people, when they go overseas and they go as short-term missionaries, they can so easily view something outside of their own context. But when they go back to their church, they can't do the same. And when I was a missionary 12 years, and I know something about missionaries. Missionaries come back, they're really nerdy in some senses, but up here, they're switched on to culture, right? They might not dress right. They might still be wearing Bermuda shorts and jams, from the 80s, but they're switched, because they've learned to see their culture. They were programmed mentally to see everything through the lens of reaching people outside of their context. And so when they return, all the missionaries I've known that have been successful on the mission field, they come home and they truly see America. It's like the fish that's the last one to see the water. They come back and they go, this water's wet. I see this culture now. And if we can do that, if we can have that kind of awakening in our own community, to come back and say, I see you have to separate yourself out from your culture, to come home, you have to leave it, and then when you come back, you see everything. It's like when you move out from your parents and you come back and you look at how your parents lived and you see it differently. So there has to be a way. And I think Paul, when he says in that passage, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. He had left that culture for long enough now, living like a Gentile, that he was saying, you say, Paul, you were a Jew. What he's saying is culturally, I learned to disassociate myself from everything, analyze it, examine it, pray for it, and then come back and strategically engage it.
I was meeting with a church planner yesterday, and we were talking through some of his strategy, and he was telling me that he really wants to reach those who are in need in his community. And so he was walking through that strategy, and they're going to do a pop-up tent on a certain part of town and mobilizes people to go serve them. And then they'll go to another part of town next month and pop up a tent and serve those in need there. And, haircuts or whatever people need, and that sort of thing. And I said, well, that's good. I said, but you got to be careful because I think so many times church planters and churches, pastors, we will mobilize people towards a need and towards a cause. But the people in their mind, they're going in and going, look what we did. We feel good about that.
Right.
And then they go back home. And I said, what you got to do is and a lot of times they do it to say, hey, we're doing this because we're starting a church. That's the only reason we're doing this, to try to build a reputation in the community for our church. And I said, man, if you're going to do this, condition the mentality of your people that this is a value that we want to be integrated into our soul.
Right.
That this is a part of our character. We're not doing this because we're going to go start a church. We're not doing this to just go meet a need. We're doing this because we want to live like Jesus. And we want to have the character of Jesus. We want to live the lifestyle of Jesus. And that's what Jesus would do. That's why I'm going to go do it. And I said, one of the most dangerous things you can do is not build that, is to send them on mission like that without giving them the mentality first.
So true. I remember when we first came back and we were ministering in Long Beach, Liberty had like a quarter or 2 quarters, in her little, my daughter. And she was about 2.5 years old. And we were parked at a stoplight getting ready to turn left. And in California, homeless people often stand on that little island divider and, take. And I hear the window in the back seat go bzzz. She's got her little offering money for church because she knows this is just what we do. We help people. But one of the dangers, like you said, is this paternalistic. And homeless people know, like they feel. I've learned this over the years because when we were in Wales, I was in communities where the industry, steelworking, coal mining, has shut down, and it's hard for us to fathom communities that have 60 to 70% unemployment rates, but where literally everyone within a square mile would be what they call on the dole or on some type of welfare. And so we learned pretty quickly that people still have their dignity and pride, even when they don't have money or homes. And homeless people are the same. They still have dignity. So this was one of the things that we had to pray through as a church, because we started in one of the poorest areas, like I said, around that boulevard there. It was notorious. But the school that we eventually moved into a block and a half away was the poorest school in the district. And they found that it was mostly ethnic makeup. There was 10% Asian and white. The rest was all from other ethnicities. And what happened was, they said, we found that there's a huge immigrant population here, and these families, they're only able to feed their children once a day. So the school, the only school in the district, started serving breakfast. So we said to the principal, how can we help? And they said, you can serve breakfast on Sunday morning. That will help us, because there's 2 days of the week. These kids are left to eat 1 meal a day. So we did that. But I knew that what we don't want this to be is we feed you homeless people and we feed you poor people, because nobody wants that, right? So what we did is we had to change our language. I can remember one Sunday going up and saying, hey, some of you guys in here, you don't have homes. And people would call you homeless as if that's your identity. But I want to encourage you today. The difference between having a car and not having a car doesn't change who you are, nor does it having a house versus not. You are our brothers and sisters. And by the way, guys, we're about to worship this morning. We're about to worship a man who himself was homeless when he lived here. Jesus said, I am homeless. I have no place to lay my head. He didn't have a house. Does that make him? Was that his identity? No, his identity was he was God. He was God incarnate, and yet he was homeless. And I'm telling you, I never heard so many amens, from homeless people as I did that morning, that they suddenly, it changed, theologically, it changes your perspective. Based on the stuff you own, I'm going to treat someone different. But then we had to change our language between, people would come and I remember something you said that really resonated, because I planted this church before I met you, but in hindsight, a lot of things you had said, I'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so true to our experience. For example, you said people will join you sometimes not because of what you say or whatever, but it's because of your mission. They identify with your mission. And people would come and they would say, hey, we we really identify with the fact you feed homeless people. And we'd have to say, no.
Yeah.
We don't feed homeless people. We eat together as a family.
As a family.
And once we got there and arrived there and people started to understand that I'm sitting across from a homeless guy named Bob, and he's my brother in Christ, and he's come to faith. I'll tell you, we saw so many people come off the streets because of that mindset. So there was a guy, he started to open up his home, which was the park, for a home study.
Yeah.
And he started seeing other homeless people. He is now driving a forklift in a company in Costa Mesa that makes custom grills. He is not the same dude.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, he still runs a home study in the park. He doesn't live there anymore.
Wow.
But he chose, by the way, he lives in an apartment, but for a while he said, I choose to live, even though I have a job, I'm going to choose to live in the park just a little bit longer because I still need to reach people here. And we saw so many people come off the streets that are now, they have jobs, they have homes, you know.
If we got to be so careful not to treat them like projects, but treat them like people, because when you relate to them and they begin, like the homeless guy that I talked to today, I said, hey, you and I are not that different, you know.
That's
and
the
we begin
key.
to talk, and we begin to connect soul to soul, heart to heart. And I was enjoying him, and I could tell he was enjoying me. And it got to the point, Peyton, it was hilarious. He said, can I tell you a joke? And I said, yeah, you can tell me a joke. He said, there was a guy who was talking to God. And the guy said, God, I don't need you anymore. And God said, you don't need me anymore, huh? He said, no, don't need you anymore. And God said, okay, well, why don't you need me anymore? And the guy said, because I can make anything I want. And God said, well, show me. And so the guy reaches down, picks up some dirt. And God looked at him and said, put that dirt down. Use your own dirt. And so the point is, you know, he felt comfortable enough. Now he was like, okay, I feel safe with you.
Yeah.
I want to relate to you and enjoy you. And so as we go serve people,
true.
I think one of the goals is I want to enjoy them and I want them to enjoy me. And that can make a huge difference.
That's what Jesus did. I mean, every story that we have of a conversation with Jesus, he sits down and he just listens to people.
Yeah.
He just hears them. He values them. Jesus wasn't building a church. He wasn't a church planter. I mean, we could stretch it and say, oh, sure. But he had no church to speak of during those 3 years. Yeah. And yet what he modeled was God cares about you.
Yeah.
If we approach everyone like, I think that's such an important rule to kingdom work, is to approach it with a kingdom mentality. Approach everybody like, I may not see you come to my church ever, but I'll see you come to Christ.
Yeah.
And somewhere there'll be 1,000 points of light, man. There'll be like all these interconnected. That's how kingdom work happens, you know?